I will start with a short announcement that tonight during presentation will be shown the images for audience 18+, and I will repeat in Ukrainian. Сьогодні будуть показані зображення для публіки 18+. Дякую. So, and now I'm happy to present our guest, Isabelle Alfonsi, our guest from France, from Paris. She's an art researcher and curator. In 2009, she created Marcelle Alix, a gallery of contemporary art in Paris, which she co-directs with Cécilia Becanovic, right? And she has been giving lectures on the lineage of contemporary queer art since 2014, some of which she performs in drag. And she has published, I think months ago, something like this, a new book. And you see it's on the screen as well, with the title, For an Aesthetic for Emancipation. So our talk will be around the topics of this book. But first, I also want to briefly present you the book which was published here in Kiev, in Ukraine, this year, The Right to Truth, Conversation on Art and Feminism. This book was co-edited by me and my colleague Lesia Kulchynska. This is a collection of 20 interviews with women artists, curators, researchers, even philosophers, on topic of how feminism, feminist agenda, political situations affected art practices of these women, and they are sharing their experiences and reflect on also on political situation in different countries in Europe, mostly from West and East Europe, because there are women from 7 countries. And this research, we start from Ukrainian French part. The most of interviews were made in Paris and in Kiev and Lviv, and was supplemented by interviews made in Poland, Czech Republic, and also there are Belarusian interview, Russian. If you're interested, you could, after our talk, have this book and ask Isabelle to sing for you, because her interview also is here. And this book was made also in a way to show how art affected and inspired by political struggle, by activism. And we have 2 parts in this book. First one is artistic practices, the interview mostly with artists, and also activism and art institutions, because all these things are connected and influence each other. And this is what also research Isabelle in her art researches, that she tries to show that art is and artworks, it's not something separate. It's art always connected with a context, with historical, with political context. And I will ask Isabelle to tell about this book. It's devoted to queer art, and maybe we will start from this definition to clarify what does it mean, queer art, because I think when we say queer art, first what we imagine it's something connected with identity, probably with sexual identity, but as I have got reading your book, you understand it more widely, as you mentioned that queer art, there are some constitutive elements of this art. It's feminism, sex-positive attitude, fight for civil rights, anarchism, collective work, and other. So I will ask you to explain this definition and to tell about this book more.
Thank you, Oksana. Yes, it's difficult, of course, to talk about queer art in different contexts, because obviously it can be understood differently, different parts of the world. But the idea with this concept, first it draws on another book who was written by an artist and a theoretician called Renate Lorenz, who's a German artist and theoretician, and who wrote a book called Queer Art. So I borrowed the concept of queer art from her, and she defines it as a method. Obviously, I mean, she is queer herself, and she it's in relationship to her identity, but she also defines it as a concept, and as a concept that is a subversive concept. The method in way I used it in the book was also to go back to history and to different artists that I knew from art history, and to try to understand how a contemporary queer art could be related to these figures in art history. So to go back in the past, as far as the 1920s until now, and to single out different figures different artists who I thought were already carrying with their work some of these issues, defining features that you named for queer art. Maybe just start by, we can just start also by defining what is queer, because it's not obvious for everyone, I think. I wanted also to go back to that in the introduction of the book, where I try to show that queer is first a political word. It goes back to a moment in time when queer was an insult, and when you said to someone on the street that they were queer, it didn't sound cool. It sounded very bad, actually. It sounded it's like faggot, like a bad word in English. So queer in English means it's bizarre, it's not straight, it's not normal, it's out of the beaten path. So it was a big insult. And so, as a lot of words that are used as instrument of empowerment, it's been reused by people who were insulted with this word to feel more powerful. So they call themselves, LGBT people started calling themselves queer in the early 90s with the AIDS crisis, during the AIDS crisis. So queer was a way of talking about women and men together, feminists, people with AIDS, so sick people, healthy people. So it was a way to talk about alliances already of different identities. So in a way, it already goes beyond identity, as it's sort of describing a way of life more than an identity. And this way of life was about getting together to fight, defending people who were maybe in a very bad condition. They were having difficulties to defend themselves because they were sick. So the AIDS crisis really propelled this moment of coming together and of political activism. So this is how it's really important to go back to history and historicize the word we use. Otherwise, we use words and these words are empty, and then they can be used by capitalism against us. So we can also talk about using feminism in different meanings. But for me, when I use queer, when I use feminist, I use a lineage of people who have fought together throughout the years, or have passed their fight to new people. So it is really in a historical outlook that I want to use queer. Because queer today, if we talk about queer as mere identity, then it can just mean, I'm gay, I'm a lesbian, I have a sexual, I have different sexuality than heterosexuality, but it doesn't have to be political. But the idea of the book is really to go back to the political meaning of queer.
Yes, and about this topic of identity, it's quite interesting because it's a very popular issue even in the West and here. So if we ban this binarity, male, female, and create a lot of other identities, do we probably we limit ourselves, but in other way. And the position also of Genevieve Fraisse, who had talk here, also is very interesting on this question. And also it depends of context. And for example, it's interesting for me in France, where gay marriage are legalized. They are still queer or not anymore? So.
Well, so in the first place, all gay men were not queer, even in the 90s or 80s. You know, there were people who had an agenda, who was just their agenda. And even my area of study was more San Francisco than it was Paris. So in San Francisco, I was told by people who lived there at the time that there was a gay community that was from the right wing, you know, and who had for only agenda to just be accepted in society, to have power. So identity, so a marginal identity doesn't mean you will have revolutionary ideas, you know, and so I think it's important to take things separately, and so for the minority identities to carry a political message and to carry a political action, we have to be aware of whatever other people than ourselves, if we are privileged, are enduring. Because if I'm I'm a woman and I'm white, I am married to a man, so I have so many privileges. I am from a bourgeois class, so I have a lot of privileges. So I could just be happy with myself and be like, yeah, great, you know, I live in a country where I'm almost not in danger, although I'm still am, because I am a woman, and women are still, even in France, the most susceptible to domestic violence or to being killed by their partners, for example. So I am still in danger, but less in danger than, let's say, you know, a transgender woman. So also this idea of just leaving identity politics to people carrying a minority identity is just leaving people by themselves. And I do believe in alliances, in getting together to defend what we think is right in terms of equality. So I don't think we can be happy feminists if we still witness that transgender people are in danger, which is the case in France still, or are still treated unequally by the state, by the government. So this is how I try to connect identity and political engagement.
Mm-hmm. So it's probably to be happy with your own identity, it's not enough. It's for example, if women are included somewhere, it's also not enough. For example, if women included in politics, it's not enough, as we see from some figures, even from French politics.
Yeah, so I just put some quotes in here in the PowerPoint, just to give some background to the research, and I mean, one of the important figures in the research was Donna Haraway, who's a scientist and an American scholar, a scholar from the U.S., where she says that all our views of the world come from our position in the world. So by being aware of my privileges, of the privileges that I have, then I can be more objective in a way. So it's exactly the contrary that the objectivity as we usually learn it, right? We learn that objectivity is to look at things in a neutral way, but we are all humans, born somewhere, living somewhere, in relationship with other people in a very specific place. So it's impossible to be neutral, to be, from, as Donna Haraway says, a view from the above. We can't. I mean, even if you fly a plane, you're still gonna be grounded in your ideas. So you can't see everything from above. It doesn't exist. So we have to. So queer thinking is also grounding us in our bodies and understanding how we can play with these bodies to understand the world differently too. So if I take the appearance of a man, will I see things differently? If I take testosterone, will I experience the world differently? Probably. So this is also how we play with these queer ideas.
Mm-hmm. And in your book, you criticize the discourse of history of art, like from big letter, for reason of this objectivity, yes, for this view from above. And you try to show that even every artwork, every art practice is always connected with political context when they appeared. And when I was reading this book, I was thinking about situation in which I am now, and we all now, because we are living in Ukraine in the period of really strong political challenges, and from the beginning of 21st century we have a lot of political art here because of these revolutionary events and so on, and also because of struggle in society. And I am a witness, I observed during even last decade and before how art was created because of this event and was affected by them. And I put the question to myself, how the history of Ukrainian art of this period will look like for example, in 50 years in the future. How we will, or our children, new generation will describe us, our practices, how they will research. And from this point of view, it's very interesting your method, how you research art of the past. You present it as a feminist art history. So could you tell more, please, about this?
Yeah, so in keeping with what I was saying about Donna Haraway and her writing, feminist art history started, let's say, in the 70s, and with strong figures like Griselda Pollock or Linda Nucklin, who were art historians who were looking at art from a sociological point of view. So instead of believing that, like a lot of art history, how it is traditionally written, is about, a lineage of geniuses. Oh, Michelangelo was a genius. Then came, I don't know, Tiziano was a genius. Then Goya was a genius. And then for the 20th century, you have Picasso, Jackson Pollock, and Francis Bacon, whoever you want to put in that category. And it's a problem that we see the art history as a succession of all these figures, by the way, all male, and by the way, art history was also written by white people, so very white, and by the way, very heterosexual, because we're never told about any of their sexual lives. But so we live in this idea that these people are not questioned in their lives, they're like, oh, they came like this, and somehow they had this incredible intuition about art, and art happened to them, so there's even stories about, oh, they didn't really learn, but somehow they were so good, and so these feminist art historians said, look, this is not how it happens, because we know that women are not intellectually challenged, or or physically challenged, they know how to make things, they know how to think. So how is it that women didn't make it into art history? So it's not about capacities, it's not about not being able, it's about being erased or just not being there. And Linda Nochlin wrote this incredible text in the 1970s called Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?, in which she shows that the reason why there hasn't been any great women artists before the 20th century was just because it was very difficult. For example, in the 19th century, it was very difficult for a woman to have the same access to art school than it was for men. So they were not able to study the nude because, you know, it wasn't seen as something nice for women to be standing in a place where there were naked people around. So they weren't able to do this. Also, they weren't really, when Impressionism was so big, you know, Impressionism was about these painters going in the city and just painting what they saw with their own impressions of the city. Well, women were not allowed to just go by themselves in the city. So even Berthe Morisot, who's this great impressionist, female impressionist painter, she only painted, you know, scenes in the garden, scenes in her home, always seen from the home. Like, so even when she painted the outside, you could see she was sitting in her home with her daughter. It's not because she was interested in being a mom. It was just because it wasn't good. Like, society didn't like her to be outside. Society didn't really like that women would just wander around just like men impressionists would. So Linda Nochlin's text says this really simply. It's like, it's not that female geniuses didn't exist. It's just that the genius is constructed by art history to be men. So of course it couldn't be a woman because just the way it is constructed just excludes women from the beginning. So this is how art history came until here, is just to question everything that art history is putting in front of us, and look at how it is seen from a different perspective. So for example, Claude Cahin, who's a French photographer from the 20s who was rediscovered in the 90s, because I guess in the 90s, because of queer theory starting to be really important, then people were looking at these self-portraits and, you know, looking at her and being like, wow, this is amazing because she's in between genders, she really is playing with the female identity. But what hasn't been said about her until recently, or what hasn't been like an important feature of the analysis of her work, is that she was in a couple with another woman whose name is Marcelle Moore, and Marcelle Moore was an illustrator. And all these photographs that they made actually together, so, you know, you see how art history likes to pick one person. Art history doesn't like couples. They don't like traditional art history doesn't like collectives because it's more difficult to explain. You know, you have to talk about different people. It's too complicated. So, you know, art history is like, okay, one person did this. Hopefully this person can be a man, it's better. Hopefully if they can be white and heterosexual, it's even better. But with Claude Cahin, she opened sort of, you know, another idea that, of course, you know, a genius could be, you know, of a different gender. But more interestingly than that, is the couple that she was forming with Marcelle Moore, and also that these images were not made to be artworks. So these photographs, for example, this photograph that you see, it was, well, first, it's like a working photograph, so it was made to be resized, like zoomed in, so you didn't see the black cloth behind her. But also, it was made more than anything else. It was made to be part of this collage that you see on the left, which is what Marcelle Moore was making illustrations for different books. This is for a book that Claude Cahin wrote. So these images, the photographs that they were making, were just distributed to a close circle of friends. All of them were lesbians. They had their own sort of intimacy with people. And these circles of women are never really discussed in art history because it is sort of also implied that the spectators of art are usually men. So when you have representation of women, it's better if these women are, you know, appealing, nice looking, and you name it. So this is how I weave a sort of thread through feminist art history, is to even to take this notch, to take this up a notch and say, okay, now we have to look as well as the political engagements of these artists, because not only were they a collective, were they two, but also they were committed to a cause which was a sort of, you know, very, very early LGBT cause, because they were working or starting a sort of LGBT rights magazine in the early 20s. So 1924 is the first issue of Inversion, Inversions. And then it was followed by L'Amitié, Friendship, the year after. So in total, there were only, I think, 5 issues of this magazine. So to see that Marcel Moore and Claude Quin were actually already activists for gay rights in the 1920s also helps us understand that if we do activism today, it's not new. Like, we're not inventing something new, you know. Even queer activism today, it was already done in the past. And so this is how history helps us to understand that we're not alone, and that we can go back to history also to find different examples of activism. Maybe I should.
I like your definition that we could have friends from the past, amis du passé.
Yes.
And it's also prove that the history is not one line, so it's like sometimes some things repeat, and have some very close things. You could find something very close for today in the past, and but this notion of genius, it's still I don't know how it's in the West now, but still quite useful here in Ukraine. And the art education, for example, when we studied at the Art Academy, history of art, it's the same as you described, and even teachers of drawing, painting, they try to apply this notion of genius when they teach you to draw, and the idea that there are some genius and you never will draw as them. And this
very
is also
encouraging.
Yeah, and this is also like I think as every history written by adopting some ideology, and this ideology also, for example, male dominated ideology or genius dominated is quite still alive. And for example, a few days ago, I observed in Europejska Square in Kiev a big, huge banner with a portrait of Ivan Marchuk, and the title is "The Genius of Our Time." So it's very strange. And so if you research in this way, how you do it, the art history, you could show the things from other point of view, from other perspective. And for example, I also was happy to have one teacher. It was not in academy, and he said to me, "You could draw as Leonardo da Vinci, it's no problem. Just you have to know some methods and so on,
some techniques."
And so to think about Ukrainian contemporary art, critical art, political art, I also could give a lot of examples of attacks on this art, of censorship, acts of censorship, and so on. And it's also the question how it will be described in art history later. But it seems to me that you research also some censored things in art history of the past. For example, these female stories, or other how art connected with some movements, etc.
Yes. A big part of the book is also looking at American or United States minimalism, which I don't know how if you learn about this here in art school, but in France and in the Western Europe, I think it's a pretty dominant movement. So because it's always this thing when you were describing how, it's very present here still, the figure of the genius. It's the same thing in Western Europe, actually France, because I don't want to speak for anyone else. But also, if you learn about a movement and then all the examples you're given in this movement are men when you're a woman, and I didn't study art to become an artist, but if you study art to become an artist and you're a woman, every example you're given is a man who's completely different from you. It's very difficult to imagine how, what are your models? What are, So because I was so interested in minimalism and a form of break that minimalism was representing in art history, I also needed to find in minimalism female artists, women who were representing something else, who were also using minimalism from a perspective that was closer to me. So I studied a film by Yvonne Rainer, who's a choreographer who was at the beginning of this experimental dance company called the Judson Church Theater. It is called like this because it started in a church in New York, the Judson Church. And she was part of this minimalist movement, which later became more acquainted to sculpture and sort of broke from its origins, which was very connected to dance and to trying to question the object of art. So the interesting thing with Yvonne Rainer is that she was a dancer, a choreographer, and then she started to make only films for about 20 years. And one of her first films, actually the second one, is called Film About a Woman Who. And it's amazing because with sort of very minimalist techniques, like voiceover, typing, still images, a lot of different techniques, she was able to really encapsulate female subjectivity of the time. So I was going through art history like this, trying to understand where I could feel something was close to me. This is sort of the method that I used. So this is, to go back to minimalism, this is also how we can sort of weave a history of minimalism, which is not as minimalist looking than it is portrayed, right? I mean, I haven't included images of high minimalism here in this selection, but I mean, some of you might remember, Donald Judd, or like the boxes, the Dan Flavin, using neon, using industrial material. So really an art without any affect, without any body, And the idea was that these objects were completely remote from any concept in a way, and you had to experiment it. So, of course, this is a discourse about minimalism that needs to be reassessed, all the time. And what I found interesting was that reassessing it also can come from the sexual lives of people who are actually very big artists of minimalism, like Robert Morris, for example. Robert Morris was involved with several women during his life. And during the beginning of minimalism, he was actually first with Simone Forti, who is a dancer, choreographer, also very close to the Judson Church Theater group. He was with Yvonne Rainer, so he was very close to these dancers. So his first work, sculptural work, was work for sets, for the stage, for dance stage. And then little by little, this became something autonomous, and it was read as a sort of incredible example of autonomous sculpture. So when you think about his work going back to dance, then it takes completely different significance. And what I think is interesting is also how he became involved at some point with Linde Benglis, who's also a sculptor, but who's doing more eccentric sculptures in the moment of minimalism, and how there was a sort of game between them, that they would make these portraits of themselves to question the image of the artist as a genius, you know. So he made this image, and then she made different images where she set herself up as, you know, a sort of muse artist and like a macho. And then this propped another image, which is an iconic image of art history now, which is a double page that she paid for in Art Forum, where she posed, so naked, as you see, with a double dildo. Part of it is inserted in her vagina, and the other part is just directed, pointing to the left of the image. It is a very assertive, a very sexual image that is showing no shame, and it was at the time a scandal, to the point when actually editors from Art Forum at the time had to decided to step down because they hated this image, and they said this image is not feminist, it's horrible, it's pornographic. But what I think is interesting in that image, in what Linda Benglis was doing at the time, is that she was reinserting the artist's body in the conversation about history of art, and what artists would do for you know, maybe to be famous or to be talked about. So she was also using this image to talk about the artist as a prostitute. And in doing that, I think she was also bringing ideas of sex positive attitudes, which I think is one of the constituent features of queer art. Yeah, so these are some images of her work now that you've seen this. Yeah, sorry, maybe you want to say something.
Yeah, I just want to mention that I was impressed the information in your book about minimalism, that we know mostly about these sculptures, male sculptures, these cubes and big things. They like some of them were presented not only in the gallery but outside. But it's something that you must deal with this object, and it was like questioning the previous sculpture. But even at that time, it was minimalism in performance, for example, done by women, and but it is not like in canon of minimalism, because as you describe these dancers, how they question the classical dance, and they create some performances with minimal gestures. It's very interesting. Yeah. Is it possible to watch somewhere these performances or movies?
Oh yeah, you could. I'm sure you can find on the internet if you look for Yvonne Rainer and Trisha Brown, and if you look for Lucinda Childs, for example, you see, and actually also Babette Mangold, who is a woman who was an artist, a photographer, and a filmmaker who was actually making the films for all these dancers. So it's actually it's a culture in itself, but somehow, because it was an object, then it became sort of the history of dance. So somehow, you know, in our art school, we have problems teaching that, because then it is seen as a different discipline, which obviously is completely stupid, because at the time, this was one discipline, basically, or it was trying to question, as you said, traditional art, and it was very much part of the discussion in minimalist practices. And also, it was at the same time as the first political movements of the youth. It was before 68. It was before, in the United States, it was during the first civil rights movement. So it's interesting to see that it's a revolution in a way. You know, it's a revolution in art, and it's a revolution in thought. So what I want to say is also that every kind of avant-garde art is also is accompanying a political revolution. If you think about someone like Kazimir Malevich, who I think maybe you know here because of a Russian constructivism. I mean, Malevich was an anarchist. You know, he was writing in anarchist journals, and it's very important to continue to teach that. And it's not very famous in Western Europe, for example, that he was a political activist as well. And so he was, you know, he's like a creator of abstraction in art. He made this big revolution, which is the black square, which we still talk about. And I never heard before that he was an anarchist. Before I read it by chance, and I was like, what? How can we continue to teach that these art revolutions are just completely, separate from political revolutions? It's wrong, and it's not only it is wrong, but it also is doing a lot of harm to our political agency, because we can use the representations of art for our political agency, I think.
Yeah. That's why probably people cannot stop asking, what does it mean, this black square?
Black square, exactly, yeah.
And probably there is the explanation with his political views and position.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And also this high minimalism, why it came to first place, because it was supplemented by theory, yeah, and probably because of some features as objective, some objective, not subjective, and this female art, it's often characterized as something very personal and connected with psychoanalysis, with some private life. Could you comment more on this?
Yeah, it's a way, this is how when women started to be visible in the 20th century, then somehow art history had to find a common feature to these works, where it would never come to anyone's mind to say, oh, you're all men doing art, you must have something in common, like this must be like being a man has to have something to do with what you do. But of course for women, because women are traditionally seen as more in touch with their bodies, because they give birth, because they have their period or whatever, then it had to be in their art. So what feminist art history is suggesting is also, okay, well, let's look at men's art like we do with women's art, and let's look at elements in their lives that would explain why they do this and that. And for example, if you look at Carl Andre's work, who's a minimalist and making, you've probably seen his work. He's making these plates, like these corroded metal plates that are placed on the floor in museum. Well, his father was working in the shipyard. His father was actually an immigrant from, I don't want to say something that shows that I don't know anything from ex-Soviet republics. So I'm not going to say where he was from, but from somewhere in the bloc. So he was an immigrant. He was working in the shipyard. And I mean, when you know that, obviously you understand why Andre was using these metal corroded plates. I mean, this is a souvenir of the shipyards where his father was working. Of course, this doesn't explain everything in the work, and we can't look at all of Carl Andre's work just thinking about his father, but still it gives you an element. Well, the idea, my idea and the idea of feminist art historians is that, well, let's have the same look for every piece of work we see. So if you talked about an artist and who does this really strange painting, like, for example, Cy Twombly, who's an American artist, did, and you never told he was gay and was involved with men all his life, then how are you going to account for his really strange painting that is completely escaping what other people do at the time, There's an American scholar who also talks about John Cage, talking about minimalism, and John Cage was a musician very close to the art circles, and John Cage became famous because of his silent pieces, and he made silence as music. So it wasn't music, it was recording silence. Well, there was an American scholar who said, well, maybe thinking that John Cage was actually gay, was actually in a couple with Merce Cunningham pretty early in his life. Merce Cunningham being, sorry that I'm giving you a lot of names, but I can write them for you if you don't know them. Merce Cunningham was also a really important choreographer of postmodern dance. So they were in a couple together, two men. And when you know that, then you can maybe explain the silent pieces of John Cage as being a strategy of resistance. So instead of making music, because it's sort of, okay, this is the 50s, it's the 60s, we can't talk about being gay, so instead of making music, I'm just going to record silence, and this is a way for me to say something about the stupidity of making music in a moment where I can't speak. So then you can look again at all this provocative art, and instead of looking at it like, oh my god, this genius, all of a sudden they had this great idea, they stopped making music and just recorded silence, but like, okay, this is a way to say something political.
And in this context of feminist research of art, which means to look not only separately on pieces of art, but to destiny of a person, of her or his political views, personal life, and so on. What to do in this situation with genius from the past, which we suddenly know that they were, for example, as Heidegger, pro-Nazi, or as Céline, for example. So they created some great, well-known things for the culture, but then later, what to do?
Wow, that's a tricky question. Well, another example, which is more in the history of art, is Picasso. Picasso was a horrible person. He was probably what do we call it now? There's a word now for these men who are like, sadist, not sadistic. I forgot. There's a name. Anyway, so a pervert, narcissist pervert. Yeah, narcissist. So it seems Picasso was a narcissist pervert. And I mean, it doesn't mean that his work was not great. I think it's pretty great. I'd like to see paintings by Picasso, but then when you know that he tried to destroy every woman he was with, and you look at his portraits of women and you see how they destroy the images of women, then it kind of that accounts for something else. It's like, oh, I read a biography of him from a French feminist art historian, and she just accounts for all the different periods in his work, talking about his relationship to women. And for example, when he was dating Dora Maar, who was an artist, a photographer, fashion photographer, a surrealist photographer, and who then started making paintings when she was with him, she was showing that just his portraits of Dora Maar are completely, this is when he completely distorts the image to a point that he just breaks the image, So, and he was completely horrible with her. So, I mean, it's just like... So I think we can still appreciate art even made by horrible persons like Picasso, because even like bad people in their life can still be good artists, and it doesn't mean you have to support them and go see all their exhibitions. You can also spend your time seeing something else or supporting something else somehow.
Maybe not so well known. It's always interesting to see something new, not only Picasso.
Exactly.
And I want to also ask you about one part of your book, because one of the topics of Kiev Biennial is a topic of Chernobyl catastrophe. So it's a big crisis which probably provoked the collapse of the Soviet Union, and reflecting on this catastrophe. These reflections are still important now. For example, this Chernobyl serial, which are very popular. But at the same period, it was another big catastrophe people faced with. It was AIDS epidemic in 80s. And you research how it affected art. Please tell about this. It's very interesting.
Yes. So I started with this artist called Michel Journiac, who is a French artist, homosexual, who was trained to be a priest. And there's an interesting letter that he wrote to the priest that he was studying with. He wrote a letter saying, okay, I learned that the church doesn't really like homosexuals. I would really like to be a priest, but then I see that it's impossible, so goodbye. And then he went on to be an artist, and he was a really incredible thinker. He wrote a lot about a lot of different things in his surroundings. He accounted for the first gay protests in Paris. These were the images that were here on the screen first, of the FAR, le Front Homosexuel d'Action Révolutionnaire, who were the revolutionaries post 68 who were trying to defend the rights, the gay rights. And this group, sorry, I'm doing a lot of digressions. I will go back to AIDS at the end, but I have to start from the beginning of my research in a way to make you understand how I did it. But this group was actually sort of a pre-queer group because it was founded by feminists and some gay men, but actually mostly feminists. So feminists were, you know, defending gay rights, although they were not completely concerned by it because it was mostly male gay rights. So this is like a really good example of alliances, but also they were fighting patriarchy and they were fighting against family structures. So to make this alliance with gay men was also to say, okay, you know, we are tired with patriarchy, we're tired with the idea of the male figure of this masculinity, and we want to make an alliance with feminine men or men who don't want to be like male men, you know. So there was this strong activism, and Michel Journiac was not really involved, but sort of together with them, you know, in different protests. He wrote about them, and he made works that I think are following this activism. So, for example, this performance that he did in a gallery in '69, where he made this cage which looked like a sort of Dan Flavin, you know, minimalist cage, and then he put like a naked man in it, and people would come and see it. And see him. So he did a lot of different things. One of the other works that he did in a gallery was to organize a transvestite transvestite show, and he had these really strange sculptures which were like saints but with a big penis in erection, and had breasts too. So it was like a weird thing at the time. So it's always mixing the vocabulary of the church because he's trying to be a priest, so he's still, you know, for him it's really important to think about this imagery, this Catholic imagery, but also sort of queer culture mixed with it. Then he did all this thing with the French flag too, so also this idea of nation was entering in this. And Journiac always had something, was doing things with blood in his work, because blood also in the Catholic imagery is really important. You know, the blood of Christ in Mass in Catholic Church. The priest drinks the wine. The wine is supposed to be a symbol for the blood of Christ. So blood is really like an important topic in Catholic religion. So there was always blood involved in his work. But then after, when the AIDS crisis started, then it became something completely different. Because first, blood was also a way for him to think, okay, if we have a lot of differences, one thing we have in common is we have blood, you know, and blood is the same. Whatever we are, we have blood. But then, of course, with the AIDS crisis, there were problems of transmission of sickness, and it went also through blood transmission. So he became aware that his whole work was becoming to be about that, about transmission and about the virus. So he started making icons for his friends who died. For example, in this picture, to the left is a picture of his friend Pierre, and when his friend died, he made what he called an icon. So icon, like like in Orthodox Church, you have these icons with gold. Well, he did the same thing, but he mixed the gold with some blood, and he made these sort of blood icons. And then one of his work that was really important, dating back from '83, was called Action de Marquage, marking. He burned himself with a triangle. So why the triangle? You probably know, but I'll just say something about this real quick. In the late 70s, it became known that the Nazis were deporting not only Jews and gypsies and political opponents, but also gay people. and they had a sign for gay people, which was a triangle. So lots of gay men in France became aware of this and realized that, gay activists, and realized that they had to talk about it and also make works about it so it could be recognized, you know, just like the Shoah was recognized by everyone, you know, the massacre of the Jews, then the massacre of gay people had to be recognized as well. So activists made films about it, and Michel Jonac did this action. And actually what's interesting is that ACT UP, so ACT UP is this organization that started in New York in '87 to defend, to create new reception and new representation of people with AIDS, and use the triangle for its symbol, very powerful symbol. So Michel Journiac in '83 already started with this symbol right before, a lot of time, like 4 years before ACT UP really starting using it too. So just to show how, you know, this had to do with starting retelling gay history, thinking about making gay history, just the idea of it, you know, how do I go back in the past and look what happened to gay people and start telling it like together with other events, but also imagery and activism. So Journiac was doing this in France. He wasn't an activist really, like he wasn't in ACT UP or he wasn't in demonstrations, but he had people around him, students, and he was doing a lot of things within the realm of contemporary art. On the other hand, in the US, you had also a strong activism under the lead of ACT UP, and also imagery that went viral in a way. So this is a campaign from Grand Fury, which was part of ACT UP, but also artists became inspired by ACT UP and also started working with the idea of virus, so the AIDS of General ID, which were replicating the love of Robert Indiana in some of their exhibitions, and images of A.A. Bronson. Sorry, I'm going a little bit fast, but I can go back if you want when we discuss. But just to say that these activists against AIDS, it was a moment when they had to produce a lot of images because they had to disidentify from the image that was produced by a dominant speech about them. So in the US, in the 80s, people with AIDS were seen as immoral, you know, they were seen as, okay, you're gay, you're gonna die from AIDS, probably you deserve it because you know what you did was wrong, like you shouldn't fuck people in the ass, that's not good, so you get AIDS. That's what was said at the time. And there was no social security, there was no nothing, so people were just dying, like a lot of people were dying, right? A lot of men were dying. So the imagery that was accompanying this catastrophe was basically, oh, you know, these immoral people, they kind of deserved it, they look bad, oh, too bad for them. So they had to make art to show something else of themselves, to show that they had power, that they could make really great art, that they could identify with something else. So there are all these images that started appearing, and that really shook how the representations in art at the time. One of them being Felix Gonzalez Torres, who was a Cuban artist, emigrated to the US, and who made work that was sort of minimalist, but with always some other interpretation that could be understood by a queer audience. It's kind of a long story. I don't know if I should go into it because I feel like we're going to have to wrap up at some point. No? What time is it?
And I just short comment when you speak about Journiac, this work with blood.
Mm-hmm.
What came to my mind that probably if he tried to question this masculinity, mm-hmm. with adding some female features. Blood, it's also something very female, as menstrual blood.
Yeah.
And probably last question I have to you, and then Ada we will, later we will give microphone to audience. It seems probably that queer became fashionable. We even feel it's here, and how it could keep its protest potential, because as you mentioned, the queer art and queer to be queer is to be in some marginalized position, even not institutionalized, but it's when you stay in some position from which you could be a critique to society. And but as we know about capitalism, how it's every protest movement could be could finished in this, because then for example new clothes for queer people could be created, etc.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
They are
so
already.
How it's possible to or what is the future of this? Because you research the past, but maybe it's not a question, but maybe you have some ideas.
Well, queer is not an end to everything, you know, like I don't think queer is the solution to everything. You know, I was talking about Malevich earlier, or feminist position is in art history, and I think, you know, the avant-garde takes different shapes and works with different movements. So, I mean, we don't know about the movements of the future. I just feel that queer was a way to look at art from the 20th century and early 21st century in a way that was that is helping us understand some of the forms that are created, and also some of the political commitments that accompanied those forms. So, you know, it's not really in terms of like how do we keep queer alive, then how do we keep aware of fighting from the margins. But it comes back to what we were saying earlier about not being happy about our privileges. You know, like, okay, maybe we can be happy when everyone is equal, but it's still very far from the case everywhere in the world. So yeah, I don't know if it's a response, but you know, once queer is completely capitalized, then we'll have to go find something else, I think, because I don't believe that it will remain untouched by capitalism. It's already the case. But I think the values that it carries with, so collectivity, anti-capitalism, anti-racism, obviously anti-patriarchal position, critique of the singular artists, is something that we can carry on, because as I try to show in the book, it's existed for a long time already, so we will carry it on, maybe with different appearances, but still, I mean, this idea of some ideas that I found were crossing the whole century. For example, the idea of friendship, that you find in Claude Cahin, because, for example, one of the magazines that she started was called L'Amitié, friendship. But you find as well in Michel Foucault, and Foucault talks about friendship as a way of being in a queer couple, in a way. Is that, well, you know, there was the so-called sexual revolution or sexual liberation, but who really got liberated? For example, women didn't benefit so much from the sexual revolution. Not always, not everywhere. So, or not in the way that they would like sometimes. So, how do we construct models that are maybe not pushing so much on the idea of sex, but maybe more on the idea of friendship, for example, or how revolutionary friendship is. You know, this was some of Foucault's ideas, but also the idea of la caresse, to fondle, so to not to go into, so not to do something plainly sexual, but like to stroke one another. What does it mean? You know, what does it mean as a relationship to the other one that's more intimate than just shaking hands or like saying hello from afar, but also not involving sexually two persons, you know? So all these things that are also capacities, give us capacities of reflection for different models than just, oh, are we having sex or not? Are we, you know, all these binary, you know, this is how queer is also interesting, queer issues, is that, you know, how it attacks all the sort of black and white things in life, you know, you're either this or that, you're either a woman or a man, you're either heterosexual or homosexual, or whatever happens in between is also, of course, maybe more critical for us than the norms that these create.
Yeah, thank you for your interesting talk.